I came home and her bed was gone, her leash, her food bowls, gone, and a single text from my mom. She was just too expensive. But Willow wasn't just a dog. She was the reason I'm alive. What they didn't know was getting rid of her meant losing everything I'd ever given them. Stay with me because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about boundaries, survival, and finally choosing myself. My name's Grace. And for most of my life, I believed being the strong one meant staying silent. But not anymore. When I opened the door to my apartment, the silence hit harder than I expected. Not the kind of silence that says you're home and safe, but the kind that tells you something's wrong. Deeply, painfully wrong. There was no sound of paws on hardwood, no eager huffing, no familiar tap-tap-tap of Willow's tail brushing the wall near the entry as she waited to greet me. Just air, still and hollow like someone had vacuumed the soul out of the place. I stood there with my suitcase still in hand, keys dangling from my fingers, trying to rationalize the absence. Maybe she was napping. Maybe my neighbor had her for the afternoon. But then I scanned the room. Her bed. Gone. The metal bowls by the kitchen. Missing. The leash by the door. The toy with the fraying rope she loved pulling on the little scratch marks near the couch from her excitement. All erased. It wasn't just that Willow wasn't home. It was that someone had tried to erase the fact that she ever lived here. A slow panic rose from my chest to my throat, the kind that didn't come all at once but built steadily like water backing up behind a dam. I dropped my bag and stepped through the apartment room by room as if maybe I'd find her curled in a corner. But deep down I knew no dog I had ever loved, especially not Willow, would sit silently when I walked through the door. When I reached the kitchen, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A text from my mother, just one line. We had to give her up. Pets are too expensive. I stared at it. We gave her up. Pets, expensive. The words played over and over again like a broken loop in my mind, each time distorting into something more offensive. We as in who gave them the right. Gave her up as if she was theirs to surrender. Pets. God, that one burned. And expensive. The final insult, reducing everything Willow was to a monthly food bill. I didn't move for several minutes. I just sat down on the edge of the couch, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to process how the person who gave birth to me thought this was an acceptable action, or even her decision to make. And here's the thing that would never be visible in that single text: Willow wasn't a pet. She wasn't a luxury. She was my seizure alert dog, my lifeline. 2 years ago, I'd found her curled in the back of a kennel at a county shelter. She didn't bark when I passed her cage. She didn't jump or whine. She just looked at me, steady, still, and tired, like she had seen too much for her short life but still had something left to give. I didn't go to that shelter looking for a service dog. In fact, I hadn't even told anyone yet that my epilepsy had worsened, or that I'd started experiencing drop seizures without warning. I didn't tell my parents either. Why would I? They'd only ever responded to health news with mild inconvenience or judgment. But I saw something in that dog's gaze, a quiet resolve, and something in me whispered, she'll understand. I brought her home that day with a $100 adoption fee and a vague hope. Then I got serious. I poured every spare cent I had. Delaying vacations, skipping dinners out, taking freelance data entry gigs, into professional service dog training, 6 months of certified programs, behavioral reinforcement, neurological response conditioning, Willow passed every evaluation with more grace than her name suggested. She could detect my seizures up to 2 minutes before onset. She'd paw at my knee, then gently guide me to sit or lie down. If I fainted, she'd bark in 3 sharp bursts to signal for help. She'd saved me at least 5 times that I knew of. Maybe more. So no, she wasn't expensive. She was priceless. And now she was gone. I called my mom, but it went to voicemail. I didn't bother leaving a message. What was I supposed to say? Hi, just wondering why you stole and abandoned my medical equipment while I was on a 3-day trip to Seattle. I scrolled back to the text, trying to make sense of her logic. I imagined her saying it aloud. She's just a dog. Grace always spends too much on animals. We needed the money for bills. That was the kind of thing my mom would say. Calm, justified. Like logic excused cruelty. Like logic made it not theft. I set the phone down. It felt heavier than usual. My eyes landed on the bare spot where Willow's bowls used to be. The wall still had faint indentations where her food mat had pressed for so long. The mat was gone too, of course. Thorough, clean, like she'd been erased intentionally. I didn't cry. Not right away. My brain went into logistics mode. Where had they taken her? Was she still safe? Did the shelter know she was a seizure alert dog? Would they even know what to do if she had an episode of separation anxiety? I had papers, certifications, microchip registration. Everything was filed. But none of that mattered if someone walked into a shelter and claimed ownership with the same confident voice my mother always used when taking over something that didn't belong to her. Somewhere between those thoughts, my tears finally came. Not loud, not messy, just slow and bitter. I sat in that too quiet apartment, surrounded by missing things and unbearable stillness, and cried not because I had lost my dog, but because I had lost the one being in this world who watched me seize on the floor, stay beside me until I came back, and still greeted me like nothing had changed. And someone thought that was disposable. The drive to my parents' house took 23 minutes. I counted every one of them in silence. No radio, no podcast, no idle background noise. Just the low hum of the tires on pavement and the occasional creak of my steering wheel when I gripped it too tightly at a red light. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't need to. Deborah and Stan Miller had never required appointments. They opened their door for family out of obligation, not warmth. Still, I knew they'd be home. It was Sunday, and Dad never missed his mid-morning crossword. Mom would be pruning her container garden, the one she insisted she only kept because it gave the house some status. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same. Too much so, as if the world had the audacity to keep turning after stealing something vital from me. I rang the bell once. The door opened almost immediately. My mother stood there with a kitchen towel in one hand and her phone in the other, like she'd just stepped away from an important spreadsheet of family grievances. "Grace," she said, her voice clipped and almost surprised. "Didn't know you were stopping by." "Where is she?" I asked. No pleasantries, no softening. My voice came out lower than usual, steady but heavy. Mom blinked, then tilted her head like I'd asked something rhetorical. "The dog." I nodded once. She sighed and stepped aside, letting me in like she was welcoming an inspector, not a daughter. Inside, everything was in its usual place. The white ceramic vases, the hand-woven rug from New Mexico they never visited but always bragged about. Nothing about this house said grief, guilt, or remorse. It was curated normalcy, and today it made my skin crawl. Dad was in the recliner, half turned toward the TV. He glanced up briefly, then looked back down at his crossword. "Hello, honey," he mumbled without inflection. I didn't answer him. I stayed standing. We gave her to the shelter near the park, Mom said, resuming her spot at the kitchen counter. They seemed reputable. Without telling me, without even asking. She's just a dog, Grace, she said as if the sentence contained enough logic to override all objections. She's not, I said calmly. But I could feel the tremor under my words. She's a medical alert dog, a seizure dog. You don't just give those away. Mom laughed short and almost sarcastic. Come on, you always had a flair for making things sound more dramatic than they are. I mean seizure dog. Really, we've never seen you have one. I don't have to perform illness for it to exist, I said, jaw tight. Well, if it was that serious, she said, folding the towel neatly, why didn't you ever tell us? There it was, that classic pivot, blame wrapped in concern. They always knew how to spin neglect into misunderstanding. Because when I told you about my migraines, you said it was probably dehydration, I said. When I had anxiety attacks in college, you told me to pray more. I stopped telling you things because you made it very clear you didn't want to deal with anything you couldn't fix in under 10 minutes. That's not fair, she replied, voice rising just enough to signal offense. You know we have a lot on our plates. Dad still hadn't looked at me. I turned to him. You knew she was trained, Dad. You've seen her wake me up before I passed out. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. You just let her go, I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Like she was a piece of furniture. She was expensive, Mom muttered. The food, the vet bills. And we have our own bills, Grace. We're not made of money. I paid for everything, I nearly shouted, stepping back. I paid for her training, her food, her meds, every single thing. I paid your internet bill last month, your electricity. Don't you dare say this was about money. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then my mom dropped the towel onto the counter with a thud. You know what your problem is, she said, walking closer. You treat that dog like she's your whole life. Maybe if you put half that attention into this family, we wouldn't be in this situation. I stared at her, blinking. She didn't see it. Not any of it. She didn't see the nights Willow kept me from collapsing. She didn't see the time she barked and nudged me away from the top of a staircase during an episode. She didn't see me. Not as someone with needs. Not as someone with boundaries. Just someone who existed to solve problems they created. I looked around the room. The same photos on the mantel. Ryan's baby picture at the center. None of me. Not even the school portrait I once mailed them as a peace offering. I'm going to get her back, I said quietly. And after that, I'm done explaining my worth to people who only understand cost. Grace, don't be dramatic. My mom started, but I was already walking to the door. Dad finally spoke as I reached for the handle. You don't have to make this a war. I turned to him. I'm just choosing peace. The kind that doesn't require me to lose myself to keep it. And with that, I walked out. For the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving with guilt sitting on my shoulders. Only clarity. And a deep, silent promise to myself I wouldn't let them erase her. Or me. Not again. The lock clicked behind me as I stepped back into my apartment, and for the first time it didn't feel like home. The absence was louder now. It had shape, weight. Every inch of my place seemed to echo the fact that Willow had been here, and was now gone. But I wasn't here to cry. Not today. I kicked off my shoes and moved straight to the filing cabinet, tucked beneath the bookshelf. It was a slim black drawer most people would overlook, but it held the pieces of my adult life I couldn't afford to misplace. I pulled it open with a sharp tug and began flipping through the folders with focused urgency. Medical, insurance, taxes. And there it was. Willow. I had labeled the folder over a year ago, back when I first registered her with the state. I never thought I'd need it for anything other than vet visits or the occasional travel form. Inside her original adoption papers, stamped with the date and the name she was given by the shelter dog number 218. The invoice from the Colorado Training Center detailing the 6-month program for seizure response and alert. Certificates of completion signed by the trainer who had once told me, "This dog was made for this work." A printed copy of her ADA classification as durable medical equipment, a phrase that never stopped making me both proud and angry depending on who said it and how. A copy of her microchip registration listing me as her sole handler and emergency contact. I ran my fingers across the pages like they were braille, like I was trying to read between the lines for some assurance that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't just a bad dream. Then I did what I should have done the second I got my mother's text. I called the shelter. City Animal Services. "This is Jennifer speaking." "Hi," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm calling to confirm whether a golden retriever mix named Willow was surrendered yesterday. She's a medical alert dog." There was a pause on the other end. "Let me check our intake records." "One moment, please." I tapped the edge of the file folder on my knee as I waited, the rhythm keeping my pulse from accelerating. The silence stretched just long enough to make me think the worst. Then, yes, Willow is here. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. She's a beautiful dog, very calm. "Are you interested in adoption?" "She's mine," I said quickly. "She's a federally protected seizure alert dog, and I have the documentation to prove that she was taken without my knowledge or consent." Another pause. This one different. Heavier. "I understand," Jennifer said, her tone shifting. "In that case, we'll place a hold on her file immediately. Can you come in today with the documents? I'll be there within the hour." When I hung up, the quiet in my apartment changed again. Still hollow, still hard. But now it had direction. I slid the folder into my bag and moved to my desk. It was time for the other part, the part I'd been avoiding for far too long. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. Then I opened a second window with a spreadsheet I'd kept for the last 2 years. Family transfers. No one else knew I had it. Not even me, really. I'd never intended to track every cent I sent to my parents. But somewhere along the way I started saving receipts, payment confirmations, utility breakdowns. Not because I wanted to hold it against them, just because I needed to see it, to remind myself that I had done enough. And there it was, $145 for Dad's heart medication, $79.30 for their internet bundle, $326 for the emergency plumber, $500 for Ryan's car repair that I suspected never happened, $2,000 in bridge support when their furnace broke during the winter. Line after line, month after month. The total at the bottom blinked back at me like a silent accusation, $14,789. And they gave away my service dog to save $60 a month in dog food. It was a moment of reckoning. I didn't feel rage. I didn't throw anything or cry or scream. I just clicked. First, I opened the joint emergency fund I'd set up to automatically deposit $250 every month. Close account. Confirm. Next, I canceled the auto payments tied to their electric and water bills. Scheduled transaction deleted. Then I logged into the pharmacy copay card I'd linked for Dad's prescriptions. Remove saved payment method. Confirm. Every click felt like a needle pulling thread through a wound. Painful, but necessary. One stitch at a time. This wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't even about punishment. It was about closure. For years, I had operated like a third parent in their household. Not a daughter, not an equal, just a solution. The one who covered gaps, plugged holes, and stayed quiet so everyone else could feel comfortable. But they gave away the one creature who made my illness manageable, who warned me before a seizure so I wouldn't wake up on the floor, who stayed with me during the darkest nights when I was too afraid to sleep. They didn't just steal my dog. They declared without hesitation that their comfort mattered more than my life. And that kind of clarity doesn't need drama. It just needs action. The parking lot outside City Animal Services was half empty when I arrived. The building itself was a squat, unassuming structure. Gray walls, small windows, and a sliding glass door that didn't open until you stood directly in front of it. I'd passed this place a dozen times before, never thinking I'd one day walk through its doors with a file of paperwork and a heart beating faster than a seizure warning. Inside the reception area was plain and quiet with the faint smell of antiseptic and wet fur. A few people sat in plastic chairs flipping through clipboards. The low hum of fluorescent lights overhead made the silence feel heavier. I stepped up to the front desk. The woman behind the counter looked to be in her 40s with curly hair pulled back in a tight bun and a name tag that read Tanya. She wore a tired smile, the kind that comes from working too many shifts in a job that demands too much from people who see too much. "Hi," I said, placing the folder on the counter. "I called earlier. About Willow." Recognition flickered in her eyes, but it didn't reach her face. "Right. The golden retriever mix. Claimed to be a medical alert dog." "She is," I said calmly. "I have her ADA certification. Microchip records, seizure response training history, and all proof of ownership. She was surrendered by my parents while I was out of town, without my knowledge or consent." Tanya blinked. "Can I see the paperwork?" I opened the folder and handed her the top documents first. The microchip registration and the seizure alert certification, then the ADA registration. Finally, the invoice from the Colorado Center with my name and Willow's ID number printed clearly. She took her time reading them. I didn't rush her. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," I said quietly. "I just want her back." Tanya looked up, her expression shifting. Something in her eyes softened, not dramatically, just enough to tell me she was recalibrating what kind of person she was dealing with. "Most people who claim service animals don't have half of this," she said, flipping the final page. "Honestly, I've never seen it this organized. I've had to learn," I said. "Paperwork is the only language some people understand." She nodded, then turned toward the back door. "Wait here. Let me check with intake." It took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Then the door opened. I recognized the sound before I saw her. One sharp click of claws on linoleum, then another, faster, louder, and then the cry, not a bark, not a whine. A low, long, throaty howl. I didn't even realize I was crying until Willow's body slammed into me. She launched herself forward, front paws wrapping around my legs like a child clinging to a parent. Her chest pressing into my thighs, her whole body vibrating from the force of her joy, or relief, or both. Her nose buried in my coat, then in my hand, then back to my knees, then up again. She couldn't stay still. Her tail wagged so violently I thought she might lift off the ground. She kept making that sound, part wail, part welcome, part plea, as if checking every second that I was real and staying. I dropped to my knees. It didn't matter that the floor was cold and smelled of bleach. None of that mattered. I wrapped both arms around her neck and buried my face into the ruff of fur near her collar. She smelled faintly of shampoo and metal cages and something else, something like fear. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm here. I'm here." She licked my face once, hard, then whined. Tanya stood a few feet away, silent. When I finally looked up at her, her arms were crossed and her expression unreadable. "We didn't know," she said finally. She didn't show any signs of stress, just sat in the back of the kennel, didn't eat much, but she didn't fuss. "She waits," I said. "She doesn't panic. She endures." "She's trained well," Tanya added, almost as a compliment. I nodded, stroking Willow's ears. "She's more than trained. She's bonded." Tanya hesitated for a moment. "You can take her home today. I've updated the system and flagged her as ADA-protected property. We'll add a note to your name and file in case anything like this ever happens again." "Thank you," I said, standing slowly while keeping one hand on Willow's back. "Do you want a leash?" she asked. "No," I said. "She won't leave me." And she didn't. As I opened the door to leave, Willow pressed her side against my leg, not pulling ahead like most dogs excited to be free. She stayed close, steady, alert. Exactly how she was trained, and exactly who she'd always been. The air outside hit my face like sunlight after a long illness. It wasn't particularly warm, but it was the first breath I'd taken all week that didn't feel heavy with loss. I opened the passenger door and Willow hopped in without hesitation. She circled once on the seat, settled in, and rested her chin on my thigh the moment I got behind the wheel. For a while I didn't start the car. I just sat there, hand on her head, thumb tracing the curve of her ear, trying to process that she was really here. Safe. Home. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely audible. "I'm sorry I let them near you." She closed her eyes as if accepting the apology before I finished giving it. We drove away. Willow's head resting on my leg, her breathing calm and rhythmic. There were still battles ahead. Conversations I would never be able to unhear, fractures in my family that couldn't be patched with polite silence. But none of that mattered in that moment. She was home. And so was I. After Willow came home, the apartment felt different. Not just because her bowls were back by the kitchen counter, or because her rhythmic breathing filled the room again while she napped by the window, but because I could finally sit still, completely still, and feel something deeper than grief. I felt clarity. It crept in slowly, not like a flash of revelation, but like a tide, quiet and constant, washing over old memories I'd shelved for years. Things I once framed as normal began to ache in the retelling, not with rage, but with realization. I don't think I ever had a childhood. I had a job, an unpaid one but deeply expected. I was the responsible one, the easy child, the one who didn't need checking in on, the one who did her own homework, packed her own lunches, and instinctively read the room before speaking. There were no emergency parent-teacher conferences about me, no tears at drop-off, no meltdowns in the cereal aisle. I learned young that good behavior didn't earn attention. It earned freedom from being a burden, and I wore that like a badge. Ryan, on the other hand, lived in a world built just for him. When he refused to eat his vegetables, Mom made pasta. When he forgot his science fair project, Dad drove to 3 stores at 9 p.m. to find foam board and markers. When he failed his driver's test, they called the instructor unfair. But when I got my first C in math, I was told to stop being lazy. When I had my first panic attack before a history presentation, they said I was being dramatic. "You're always so sensitive," Mom had said once, shaking her head like disappointment was an allergic reaction I needed to outgrow. Still, I tried. I tried harder than I should have. I brought home perfect report cards, cleaned the kitchen without being asked, volunteered for every carpool, and pretended not to hear when Mom called Ryan her miracle baby. I watched from the kitchen doorway as they praised his mediocre wins and shrugged at my milestones. And deep down, I kept believing that if I just did one more right thing, they'd finally see me. It wasn't until Willow disappeared that I realized I had never been invisible. I had just been used. Because being the strong one meant they could lean on me without asking if I could carry the weight. Being independent meant they didn't feel obligated to show up. Being the good daughter meant I was allowed in the house but never in the spotlight. Even in adulthood, that dynamic never shifted. Ryan bounced between failed jobs, random projects, and girlfriends he introduced only when they needed a couch. Each time he spiraled, my parents circled the wagons. Money, advice, sympathy, none. But when I lost my job during a restructuring and called to say I might move back in for a few months, "Well," Mom said, pausing to exhale, "we'd have to see how that would work. It's just a bit crowded." Ryan had been living in their guest room for 8 months at that point. I should have seen it then. But I didn't. I blamed myself. Again, when I got promoted, I started covering their cable bills without telling them. When Ryan missed rent, I sent it on his behalf. When Dad's meds weren't covered by insurance, I picked up the tab. And every time I clicked send on another payment, I told myself I was being a good daughter, a dutiful one. The day they gave away Willow shattered that illusion, because here's the truth that finally sunk in. They didn't misunderstand what Willow meant to me. They didn't forget I paid for her, trained her, depended on her. They simply didn't care enough. And that's when I understood. What I called being raised was really just being molded into usefulness. I wasn't nurtured. I was managed. My value had always been measured in convenience. If I was easy, I was praised. If I was in need, I was silenced. If I resisted, I was guilted. And when I finally stood up for myself, I was called selfish. There's something heavy about realizing that love in your family came with terms and conditions you never agreed to. That affection was rationed based on performance and loyalty was only expected in one direction. But there's something freeing about naming it, because once you name it, you no longer have to earn it. I stopped needing their apology the moment I stopped needing their permission to live differently. I stopped needing their love to look like mine. I stopped waiting for recognition from people who only clapped when I cleaned up their messes. Instead, I looked at Willow sleeping beside me, her paws twitching in a dream, her chest rising in slow, steady breaths. She didn't ask for more than I could give. She didn't expect me to prove I was worth keeping. She stayed, and in doing so, she taught me what family could look like. Quiet, faithful, free of conditions. That day, I threw away the photo frame that used to hold a family picture I never liked anyway. I replaced it with a candid shot of Willow's nose pressed against my knee. Her eyes upturned, her tail a blur of devotion. I wasn't the daughter they'd needed me to be, but I was the person I had fought to become. And that was enough. The messages started the next morning. I was in the kitchen stirring a pot of oatmeal and humming absently while Willow chewed contentedly on a rubber puzzle toy by the back door. The light was soft. The silence was peaceful. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was bracing for anything. Then my phone buzzed. "Mom, why is the pharmacy saying no card on file? Dad needs his prescription today." I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it and put it face down on the counter. 5 minutes later, another buzz. "Mom, Grace, this isn't funny. He could get sick without those pills. You always said you'd help with that." Buzz. Mom, Grace. Then another. This time, Ryan. "So you're seriously letting us suffer over a dog? No greeting? No question mark? No curiosity? Just accusation." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I finally understood that my words had never been what they wanted. They didn't want communication. They wanted control. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. My phone buzzed 6 more times. I poured the oatmeal into a bowl and sat down at the table. I took my time eating. Willow padded over and sat beside me, pressing her side into my leg. She always knew when I needed grounding, even without the tremors. Just energy, I guess. She had a gift for sensing the subtle shifts in me long before I could name them myself. Another buzz. Ryan. You're being selfish. I wiped my mouth with a napkin and unlocked the screen. I scrolled slowly through the flood of messages, each one climbing in urgency and indignation. There were no questions about how I was doing, no remorse, no acknowledgement of what they'd done. Just panic. Panic because the system they relied on, me, had stopped working. And then finally I replied, just one message. Just once. She's not just a dog. She's the reason I wake up alive. Then I turned off my phone. Not airplane mode. Not silent. Off. I stood and walked to the closet, grabbed Willow's leash and clipped it to her harness. Her tail wagged once, twice, and then settled. She knew it wasn't a short walk kind of day. It was the kind where we went deeper. There's a forest trail just a few blocks from my building. It's not much. Just a looping path through second-growth pine and maple, but it's quiet, shaded, and scattered with birdsong. I hadn't been there in months. We entered the trail just as the morning sun pushed through the canopy in long golden streaks. The world didn't ask anything of me there. Not a password, not a bill, not an apology. We walked in silence, the kind I used to dread. Because silence in my family always meant something was wrong. Someone was upset. Someone was withholding. Silence was a threat. But this silence, this one was mine. Willow walked beside me at a pace she set herself. Never too far, never tugging. Occasionally she'd glance up as if checking in, and I'd give her a soft nod or brush her head. No words. We didn't need them. Leaves crunched beneath our feet. A squirrel darted across the path. The air smelled like wet earth and pine resin, and I took a deep, full breath that didn't hurt in my chest. For so long I had filled the gaps. The emotional gaps in conversations, the financial gaps in emergencies, the relational gaps in a family built on assumptions. And now that I wasn't doing that anymore, the people who once called me strong had decided I was cruel. But they weren't calling me because they missed me. They were calling because they missed what I provided. There's something sobering about realizing that the first time you stop saying yes, people treat it like betrayal. Not because you changed, but because you stopped allowing them to benefit from your silence. Willow stopped ahead of me, ears perked. A chipmunk scurried through the underbrush, and she watched it dart up a tree, then looked back at me as if to say, "You see that?" Her eyes were bright, alert, happy. "I see it," I murmured, smiling. We sat for a while on a bench near the bend in the trail. She lay down beside me, resting her head on my boot. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened. The breeze in the trees, the distant rustle of birds, my own breathing. No ringing phone, no guilt. No second-guessing every boundary I'd drawn. Just stillness. And I realized something then. I didn't miss them. Not really. What I missed was the version of me who still believed that if I just tried harder, loved louder, gave more, they would finally see me. But that version of me needed rest, and silence, and space to exist without being useful. I opened my eyes. Willow was watching me, one paw twitching in a dream, her breathing soft and even. "Good girl," I whispered. And in that moment, I knew. Silence was no longer something they gave me as punishment. It was something I chose, and for once, it felt like peace. The supermarket wasn't where I expected it to happen. It had been nearly a year since I turned off my phone for good, changed my number, and drew a wide, clear line between myself and the people who once called me family when it was convenient. I didn't think of them often. Not out of anger, just out of necessity. Distance was easier when you stopped trying to bridge it. I was in the produce aisle weighing a handful of Honeycrisp apples when I saw her. At first, I didn't recognize her. The woman pushing the half-empty cart had thinner hair than I remembered. Her frame looked smaller somehow. Shoulders slightly hunched, cardigan hanging off her like it had lost its structure. She was scanning a row of bruised bananas with a distracted frown. In her hand was a booklet of food stamps. It was the stamps that made me pause. Then she turned. Our eyes met. Deborah. Her hand froze mid-air. Her eyes flickered. Not with anger or even shame, but with something closer to disbelief. Like she'd seen a ghost. I watched her mentally rearrange her posture, trying to stand taller, put a half smile on her face like old reflexes she hadn't realized had atrophied. "Grace," she said softly. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "Hi." I gave a small nod, more acknowledgement than greeting. She didn't move toward me, didn't touch her cart. Just stood there for a long, uncertain moment. "I heard you bought a house," she said. "I had a small place outside of town with a fenced yard and a screened porch Willow liked to nap on." "I did," I said. "It's quiet. Willow loves it." Her face twitched at the name. She looked down at the cart. I noticed now. Store-brand pasta-dented cans, a jug of milk near expiration. Things you buy when you're counting dollars by the week. "That's good," she said. "That's really good." I waited. She shifted on her feet. "We understand now," she said finally, her voice wavering just slightly. "About Willow. About everything." I let the silence stretch between us. Not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to see if she'd fill it with anything real, anything honest. But she didn't. So I asked softly, without malice, "Do you understand? Because you see me now? Or because you lost support?" She blinked. Once? Twice? Then her gaze dropped to the cart. That was my answer. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cold. I just felt done. There's a difference between forgiveness and permission, between healing and return. I didn't owe her either. We stood like that for another few seconds, other shoppers moving around us like we were statues in someone else's story. Then I stepped around her cart gently and continued down the aisle. She didn't follow. I didn't look back. And that, not the silence, not the absence, not the boundary, but that moment of choosing myself without needing to justify it or soften it or delay it. That was what peace felt like. At checkout, I saw her one last time in line at customer service, her back to me. She didn't turn around, she didn't wave. Maybe she couldn't. I walked to my car groceries and hand keys, loose in my pocket. The sun was already dipping behind the trees. Golden light spilled across the pavement in long, soft lines. When I got home, Willow was waiting by the front door, tail sweeping slowly against the floor. I set the bags on the counter, clipped her leash, and we headed out into the cool evening air. We walked past the field where the grass had just been cut past the mailbox I finally bothered to decorate down the street, lined with quiet homes and aging maples. The world was still spinning, but I no longer felt like I was holding it up for anyone else. "Guess who I saw today?" I said to Willow. She glanced up at me, then kept walking. her tail wagging once slow and steady. "Yeah," I said. "You're right. Doesn't matter." We rounded the bend and kept walking into the dusk. My hands were steady. My voice was quiet. My heart didn't ache. And that was everything. The park near my new home wasn't anything grand, just a patch of open field, a few benches, and a dirt path that looped through a cluster of trees. But it was quiet, consistent, safe. Everything I hadn't realized I needed until I had it. Willow lay curled at my feet, her head resting gently on my boot, one paw tucked under her chin. Her breathing was steady, her body warm against the fading chill of the late afternoon. We came here often, especially on the days I felt the world pressing too close, or when the quiet inside me started to feel too heavy. Today wasn't one of those days. Today the quiet felt earned. I leaned back on the bench, tilting my face toward the sky, the soft spring breeze playing with the edges of my sweater. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the distant hum of children's laughter from the playground. This was peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because I'd gotten some grand apology, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone's permission to feel whole. I glanced down at Willow. She was older now. A little more gray around the muzzle, a little slower on the trail. But her eyes, those eyes that had once stared at me through the rusted bars of a kennel door, still held that same steady presence, that unwavering calm. I could still see her there, even now. The day I found her, I hadn't been looking for a dog. I'd gone to the shelter that morning because I'd woken up feeling like I couldn't breathe and figured maybe being around something alive would help. They took me through the back corridor. Rows of cages lined the walls filled with barking, pacing, jumping dogs. Loud, desperate energy. But not her. She sat at the far end, pressed into the corner of her cage, silent, watchful, waiting. The tag read, Dog number 218, mixed breed, female, approx 2 wires, no name, no notes. I knelt down in front of the cage and she looked straight into me. Not at me. Into me, like she already knew. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She just waited, and something in me cracked open. That day I signed the forms, handed over what little money I had, and brought her home. I named her Willow. Because she was flexible, quiet, and somehow still rooted. Back then I thought I was saving her. But now, sitting in this park, her breath warming my ankle, I knew better. I didn't rescue her. We rebuilt each other. She had become my anchor when the world spun too fast, my mirror when I couldn't see myself, and my witness when no one else was paying attention. She knew the worst of me. Panicked, shaking, silent. And stayed. She didn't ask me to prove my worth. She never tallied my failures. She didn't ask if I was okay before deciding to love me anyway. She just stayed, and in return I did the same. I gave her food care structure. But more than that, I gave her safety. A place to belong. A quiet kind of reverence that said, you matter because you are not because you serve. Funny. It's what I'd always wanted too. A place where I didn't have to earn the right to exist. A life where my value wasn't tied to performance. A love that didn't withdraw the second I said no. I thought I had to be useful to be loved. But Willow never asked me for usefulness. She just asked me to stay. And in doing so, she gave me permission to do the same for myself. The sun dipped lower in the sky. A golden hour glow bathed the grass in warmth, making everything look softer, kinder. A child squealed somewhere near the swings, followed by laughter. The world kept turning. But mine had changed. I reached down and brushed the side of Willow's face. Her eyes opened just slightly enough to meet mine. She didn't move, didn't react, just breathed slow and sure. And I knew that was all she needed to do. I smiled. To anyone watching, we were just a woman and her dog in a park. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. But to me, this moment was everything I had fought for. I sat up, pulled out the small notebook I sometimes carried, and scribbled a line at the top of the page. It came out without hesitation. If you were raised to serve, not be seen, this story is for you. Then another. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's how healing sounds. I closed the notebook and let the silence settle in again. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because for once I didn't need to say it aloud to know it was true. I had found something better than their approval. I had found my own voice. Quiet, sure, and finally free. And she had never left my side. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt like the one who had to be strong, quiet, or useful just to belong, you're not alone. Have you ever had to set a boundary with people who once called it love? Have you ever had to walk away, not out of anger, but out of survival? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this resonated with you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notification bell. We share more stories like this, real, raw, and quietly powerful, every week. Because healing often begins with being seen. Thank you for being here.